We've been watching President Barack Obama at the G20 on a day when Iran revealed a previously secret nuclear facility used for enriching uranium. The president said he prefers to resolve the dispute with Iran diplomatically, but he did not rule out any options. Let's bring in Jamie Rubin, former spokesman for the State Department. Jamie, according to several reports we heard prior to this press conference, and I think things that the president alluded to during his Q&A session with the media, Russia was kind of surprised with the revelation of this new nuclear development in Iran. If, A, do you believe that? And B, if they were surprised, does that make our position vis-a-vis dealing with Iran stronger, and why?
First of all, I doubt the Russians will end up surprised when they've finished absorbing all the information that's been provided and what the Iranians say back, because in the end, this will be another enrichment uranium facility, very similar to one that's already existed. The Iranians will make the same arguments, and in the end, the Russians will have to come to the same judgments. But in a tactical sense, in a sort of today, tomorrow, the next day sense, the Russians probably did not expect this to become a public issue right now, and they may not have had the same intelligence that we had. But when you examine very carefully the White House fact sheet about this facility, they make clear that it doesn't change the intelligence community's assessment that Iran has not begun an actual nuclear weapons program. And so we're back to the same dilemma that we've been facing for quite some time now. This revelation today is important. It has highlighted the dilemma we've been facing for quite some time, but it doesn't change that dilemma. The dilemma is that Iran is going full bore for the ability to enrich uranium to a level that is not weapons grade, but they will have the capability inherently to increase that, an inherent breakout capability. Meanwhile, the U.S. intelligence community doesn't think they have a nuclear weapons program right now. And so that difference between having an inherent capability, having a peaceful so-called nuclear energy program, and actually building weapons is something where countries like the United States, France, and Britain are extremely worried, and they take a tougher stance. Countries like Russia and China, as long as they don't believe the Iranians have begun actually enriching uranium to weapons grade, as long as they believe that the Iranians are still not actually engaged in a nuclear weapons program, their response is going to be limited. And so we're going to be in the game that the president was talking about in the last question, which is some form of sanctions.
Well, but you say the same dilemma, and you just mentioned sanctions. I mean, the UN has been rather a toothless tiger when it comes to sanctions, hasn't it? We've been talking about sanctions as a country vis-a-vis Iran for 30 years.
Well, in the last 3 years, President Bush and now President Obama have gone to the Security Council and sought some form of economic sanctions. They're quite limited. They affect certain industries, certain individuals. They're not, you know, the kind of embargo, say, that we have on Cuba. I don't think we're going to get that kind of embargo. This information doesn't dramatically transform the case the Iranians have or the case the Americans have. It's very effective tactical intelligence that will put the pressure on Russia, put the pressure on China, but it's not going to change their fundamental position. We're not going to see an economic embargo, some sort of blockade of Iran or something like that. And the truth is, and this is what the last question brought out, which is most experts, most people involved, have a hard time seeing why this particular regime, now that it's become even more extreme with this recent election and the crackdown, will capitulate in the face of an economic sanction of some kind. And so this dilemma is going to become even starker in the coming months for the president.
You know, you have lived within the diplomatic world for a large part of the last 15
You're about to
20.
Throw one at me, I think.
Well, no, I'm not. I think, you know, the average person listening to you might say to themselves, you just referenced the embargo in Cuba. And the average person might say, how crazy is this? The only missiles they have in Havana are cigars, Robustos. And these people in Iran, the government of Iran, at least the government of Iran, might be capable of assembling a nuclear warhead, and yet we can't provide tougher sanctions on Iran than we provide on Cuba? That's like crazy stuff.
Well, I agree that the Cuba embargo is something that most people will never understand why they're singled out for this extreme economic sanction. I certainly agree with you that that has always been an outlier in terms of why the U.S. has taken such an extreme stance. But the bottom line, Mike, is that we're going to have limited economic sanctions posed against Iran. There perhaps will be some form of restriction on certain oil products, maybe gasoline if we're very lucky, but I doubt that. And in the end, this regime, particularly one now run by the more extreme version of the Iranian revolution, those who have been left after this terrible crackdown, which involved many of the members of the government and the elite and the establishment there breaking from the revolutionary guard that seems to be in large part in control, that what's left of the Iranian government is the least likely to be subject to economic sanctions. So all I'm saying here is that the president has and his team have done a great job of highlighting the tactical situation to put some pressure on Russia. But now this is a major international issue. They themselves have highlighted it, have brought it to supersede the entire economic summit here in Pittsburgh that's taken place. And yet the result, as you saw in that last question, is no closer to achieving the Iranians stopping this program. And we're headed for, in the coming months, some big questions. Do we learn to live with this inherent capability, or do we do something much more drastic?
We're joined now, Jamie, by Chuck Todd, who was in Pittsburgh, was at the press conference. Chuck, Jamie Rubin, you just heard Jamie talking about the answer to the last question that the president gave about sanctions, and Jamie seems to feel, he'll correct me if I misinterpret it, that while Russia and China will be on board, he thinks, for sanctions, they are tiptoeing into the realm of sanctions and might not end up agreeing with tougher sanctions, nearly as tough as we would want. What's the feeling within the White House and the administration about how hooked into this Russia and China happen to be?
Right now, they're very bullish on the fact that they think Russia is on board. The statement that Russia put out today was tougher than they would have thought they would have gotten out of the Russians, say, even just a couple of days ago. So they're bullish on this idea that the Russians privately really do feel a little bit burnt by the Iranians in the fact that the Iranians were concealing this. The U.S. folks that I've talked to, some sources I've talked to, indicate that it's pretty clear to them the Russians didn't know about this site, and that bothers them, not on the intelligence front, that bothers them in that relationship. They'd been out there defending Iran, had been sort of, in many ways, China has sort of been hiding behind Russia in this divide between between Britain, France, and the U.S., and where China and Russia stood on this issue. And so suddenly, if you've got Russia aboard, the hope among those in the White House is that that will bring a reluctant China. They're still acting very reluctantly, and they're not there. And that's where I think Jamie could be very right in that China might not be ready to go with as tough as sanctions as the U.S. would hope for. But I tell you, on one hand, they talk about North Korea, and they'll sit there and say, you know what, hey, we got the Chinese on board, some of the toughest sanctions against North Korea that anybody has gotten out of the Chinese in a long time. That's fine. Iran, though, is going to turn into a domestic political fight in this country, and the pressure the president is going to feel on this front, I think, is so much different than North Korea. You're going to see congressional Republicans and a lot of Democrats. I mean, today, Joe Lieberman, Evan Bayh put out joint statements today about their feelings on Iran. It was a very hawkish statement, very sort of a message to the president about getting tough. There could be bipartisan bills that come out of Congress with a lot of teeth, a lot of sanctions in it that could just pop up as a bill for the president to sign before he can make any headway, frankly, when it comes to what he's trying to do, this P5+1. And then you have this line in the sand that the president sort of drew on for next week, but then said, well, they have a few weeks, so you know, look, it depends on what the Iranians do. Do they show up, number one, and do they agree to some basic things that these 6 nations have been asking for them for, starting with allowing for some inspections by the International Atomic Agency?